My name's Morgan Jaffit. I am the creative director and one of the founders at Defiant Development. The gentle song of the door in the background. So Defiant Development's been running for 5 years now. We are an independent game developer. We initially focused on a combination of mobile projects and work-for-hire projects. For the last 2 years, we have been working on a game called Hand of Fate, which is a PS4, Xbox One, PC, Mac and Linux title that launched in February and has done really solidly for us. And what I wanted to talk about over the course of this talk is kind of the genesis of that project, how we started, how we've gone along the way and how that's worked for us. And I also want to talk a little bit about kind of the broader overall market and where I see the opportunities for indie developers right now. Because that's ultimately the most important thing, is that you go somewhere where you can find an audience for the work you've done. So Hand of Fate started 2 years ago, and it started as a result of another project that we had that was actually a publisher-based project that got cancelled. So that publisher had decided that they weren't going to do mobile stuff anymore, and they shut down the whole department on their side. So that was a whole kind of studio that got shut down. And in the course of that, they shut down about 15 external projects. One of those was one of our projects, and that left us at a loose end, but with some opportunity to follow our own stuff for a while. We had a little bit of runway. There was a little bit of runway in addition to that from the cancellation fees. So we had the opportunity to sit down and go, well, what are we going to do next? And this is, I think, at its fundamental, this is a decision that you only get to make every so often, because even small projects end up taking forever. It's the nature of game development that even when you start out on a small kind of 3-month cycle project, it might take 3 months, and then it may take, 2 months of testing, and then it takes a month of submission, and then 6 months later, from when you've started, you've actually got it out, and then you've got post-release support, and that's another 3 months. So with the exception, some developers get 2-3 projects out a year, but for most of us, the thought about what we're going to do next and how we're going to go about it is really important. And it's important. It's a significant decision to be making. And in our case at Defiant, we were doing roughly 50-50 work-for-hire projects and our own projects. So all of that got stretched out more. And it means that whenever we were looking at doing our own projects, that was all through the money that we'd earned doing work-for-hire. So we'd earned enough to put money in the bank to be able to do something. And you don't want to waste those shots. So you think about them a lot. And then on the flip side, you think about, what are you excited by? What's the team excited by? What can everybody get behind? And in the case of the kind of origins of Hand of Fate, we also had 12 people roughly on the team. We're about 15 now. We were 20 odd when Hand of Fate shipped, but some of those were contractors and QA. So we've kind of slimmed down to about 15 now. By the time we're about 12, and when a project gets cancelled, you basically say, okay, everybody, stop working on that. No point doing anything there. And the natural next question is, so what do we do? To which the answer is, we have no plan. Because we weren't planning to get cancelled, so we don't know what we're doing next. And from that, we had a game that was sitting on the back burner. There was one of the things we talked about doing long term, and it wasn't well planned. It didn't build on our strengths, and it had no roadmap laid out. So, and it was kind of a space adventure thing. So space adventure thing, we said, okay, that's the next thing on the list. That's what we were going to think about moving next. Let's start doing that. And that was a disaster, because anytime you start with no planning, no production, no real idea, and 12 people trying to chase a concept, you just don't go anywhere productive. So it was after a couple of weeks there that I think it was Sean, our art director, who very politely, took me aside and said, "This is fucking stupid. Get a real idea. Come on." And we did. We sat down at that point. We said, "Look, What have we done previously and what worked well about it? And how can we build on those skills to do what we did next? In this case, what we'd done previously is a game called Hero's Call, which was a tablet-based kind of action RPG that you probably haven't heard of. It did okay, but it didn't do huge. And to make that work, we'd built all of these systems that would let you randomly generate content. And it was randomly generated narrative content, and you could play any part of the game at any level, at any time, and it would always be balanced exactly to where you were coming up to next, and set up so that you could have a really streamlined experience from moment to moment to moment. And we did a really good job of all that balancing, so good in fact that nobody ever noticed that we were randomising stuff. And they just presumed that we'd put together a kind of okay linear sequence of the game. And that was the thing that we sat down at the end and we went like, what worked, what didn't? Well, we made really clever systems and nobody knew anything about them. Is there somewhere we can merge that? And at the same time, we were looking at the business landscape, which is kind of what my partner Dan and I do on a regular basis, is we try and sit down every 12 months and say, what's going to happen over the next 12 months? We thought we were shipping projects about every 12 months at that point in time, so that was the important, you know, if we start the game here, we will launch the game over here, what's it going to look like when we get over here? And in the case of Hand of Fate, we said, because we're very canny, we said things with controllers will be big. That Ouya, that's going to do something. And from this, the Ouya was terrible, terrible disaster. Everything we predicted. So we had a long list, and our list went Ouya, which is to say mobile devices with controllers. That's coming. That's big. That's just had an enormous Kickstarter. This is clearly way of the future. Also, there were rumours that Apple was going to launch an Apple TV with a controller, and we thought, oh. Also, there was rumours that Apple might have some sort of controller-like device that plugged on a phone, so that sounded good. Google and Amazon, both rumoured to have controller-based devices. And somewhere way down the bottom of that list, the Xbox One and the PS4 were coming out with controllers, presumably, but who really cares? So, luckily for us, as the project went through, we went, oh, Ouya's a flaming disaster. So that's no good, but we're still making this controller-based game, right? So we're down to like the various console manufacturers. And whenever you talk, we're lucky enough to occasionally get to talk to Apple reps or Google reps or Amazon reps. And whenever you talk to them, they will never tell you a straight answer to a question. And half the time with these great big organisations, that's because they don't know, because they don't have clearance to know. But they will never tell you they don't know, because they don't want to look like they don't know. So you ask them leading questions like, so things with controllers, eh? We're making a game of that style. Is that interesting? And they say, that could be interesting to us. You should keep us in the loop. And you're like, that means something. It means something. Turned out what that meant is they were making a watch. But so you basically, it's all, a lot of it is voodoo and a lot of it is about, in the case of Defiant, being about a 10 to 15 person team, we move slower than a 2 or 3 person indie, but we move much faster than kind of big EA style studios. So we try and be as responsive as we possibly can. And the genesis of this project was those two things. One was us saying, we randomised a lot of stuff, we hid it from the players, we built a lot of systems, and it was really clever, but nobody noticed. And we think Ouya's going to be huge. Let's aim for that. And where the randomisation led to was the conversation about, okay, should we scrap that and just do a linear game? Or should we stick with the randomisation and see if there's some way we can expose that to the player? The conversation of how do you expose it to the player led very quickly to cards. A lot of us are board gamers and card gamers. And I don't know how many of you know about Hand of Fate in any detail. I'm going to presume none of you. Hand of Fate is a card-based action RPG, roguelike, with kind of FTL-ish elements mixed with a dungeon master fighting fantasy. It's a lot of things jammed together, but it kind of works in the end. But right at the heart of it, it's a deck building card game. And that was what we'd hit on as the opportunity for us to take the systems we'd built and give the player some control over them. You know, if you take all of these random elements and you make them cards in the game, then you can enable them to build their own deck, choose how that plays out. That deck then gets dealt out as a dungeon floor for the player to play through. And you're giving the players both visibility into the mechanics that we built, but also control over them. And as soon as we said, card game, everybody was like, great, totally stoked. We play card games, we understand card games, as opposed to when you were talking about that weird space thing that could be anything. Card games we get, we understand, we can start making, we can get building stuff. And from there, we went through a real process of evolution. And I suspect in this fashion, we have this in common with most of the developers in the room. You know, big studio development is much more about building a monolithic design doc, outlining all the systems at the start, trying to organise 200 people to work in an organised fashion on that game. You can see that in Ubisoft games that kind of are starting to feel like they're struck from the same pattern. Watch Dogs feels like it takes the systems of Assassin's Creed and kind of rolls them into a different theme and a kind of cyberpunky near future. We don't do that at all. We just kind of grow games. So you start with a concept and you start building things and simulating things and putting systems together. And then you see which things make sense to add to that. And the process of growth for Hand of Fate was a really interesting one. So we started with this kind of mocked up card game that we had. And we knew that from Hero's Call, we had an action RPG, Diablo style combat. Except we'd built that from the ground up to be touch-based. And now we were going for controllers because still at this point in time, we believe in Ouya and all of its followers. So we started building controller-based systems, and we realised that controller-based kind of action RPG combat is something that's, that has a very high bar. And our general approach is to try and do everything we can do well. We look at our team and say, we're a slightly bigger team than most indie teams. Therefore, if we go after that sort of stuff, we can execute at a high level and we can make work that always looks polished. It doesn't always find its audience. It doesn't always, you know, we don't always make hits, but we always make stuff where we're like, yep, we've done a really great job of that. So what was good is being, you know, 15 people, we had effectively gone head-to-head with God of War, which made it a lot harder to hit the bench because they have 15 people just animating their main character, let alone building all their combat systems. And that was where we hit the first kind of major obstruction, which was that in order to make the game that we thought we were going to make, which was a card game with controller-based combat, the card game bit we had in control. That felt right in our wheelhouse, but the action RPG-based combat side, we had a long way to go. And we had a lot to learn just to bring the bar up to where the expectation was. Because it's a truth, and this is a truth we learned. We did a proof of concept for a game called Warco, which was a first-person simulation of being a video journalist in a war zone. And that was a really interesting project, and we learned very early on that as soon as you're in first person, you get a few different things happen. You get some people saying, gosh, that's really interesting. I'm fascinated to see how you're replicating the experience of being in a war zone, which we've done in a lot of games, but this is a different perspective. Now I'm interested in videotaping the action and staying out of trouble. But at the same time, you had a bunch of people going, well, it looks a bit shit, doesn't it? Call of Duty looks great. Why don't you look great? What's wrong with you? Your game's stupid. And that's fair enough. Anytime you look like a AAA game in terms of your overall kind of aesthetics and mechanics and genre, you better be prepared to bring at least an A game, if not a AAA game. And that's why, you know, pixel art's been a great choice for indie devs for a while because it naturally sidesteps that question. You know, your game will still look like a great pixel art game and nobody's going to look at it and say, well, Call of Duty looks better. Because that's clear and obvious to everybody and you're not going for the Call of Duty benchmark. But having gone kind of head first into that, we had a bunch of things to deal with there. We had, you know, issues of responsiveness of controls and what makes controls feel responsive. And the answer to that is that you get some feedback on your animation within a couple of frames of pressing the button. And the question then becomes, well, if I'm already in another animation, do I just snap to the new animation? Do I start to blend? If I do start to blend, am I then stuck in this blend? What if I press the button again? Do I just go, like if I just hammer the button over and over again, do I just start my animation constantly? That feels responsive, but it also feels like a jerk and stupid. So it's really, you know, we had just started to go down the rabbit hole, and it's really good that we were completely ignorant when we started, because if we weren't, we wouldn't have done it. And at each point, we would look around and evaluate kind of benchmark games, whether that's Arkham Asylum or God of War or even Assassin's Creed or other games in the genre, and we would say, huh, what are they doing that we don't? And we'd make a list, and we'd go back and we'd look at those sorts of things, and we'd videotape them, and we'd time how many frames. You know, you'd step through those frames and you'd press the button and you'd try and evaluate that all. And this is, I think this is one of the most important things in general, is that you need to have a critical eye to sit beside your creative eye. So you need to be able to look at other work and break down why it works. And the truth of the matter is that every time we went to break it down, we were just breaking down the very, very top layer. Because we now understood enough to be able to look at this bit and go, oh, they're doing that quite well. Cool, now we've got it. And then we put them together and we go, that doesn't feel great. Well, what else are they doing? And, you know, you step through a lot. There are a lot of core, you know, interesting decisions along that road. And it really gives you a good sense of, you know, what the decisions are that God of War's made that make it a different and distinct game from Devil May Cry, for example. And in our case, we ended up with a system that I'm very happy with in terms of what we've built, which is kind of an Arkham Asylum-based combat system that feels pretty good and responsive so long as the frame rate's up, which leads to a whole bunch of different questions about animation-driven stuff. But what we weren't able to do once we'd gone down that road is have the kind of gear and equipment and the card play side have as much influence as we'd liked. You know, one of the first things that people requested was, you know, okay, great, I can use a sword. That's good. Can I use a two-handed sword? Can I use a spear? Can I use a crossbow? And in our case, what we'd done is we'd built an entire chain of animations that drove everything about the character, and every one of them was interlinked and interwoven. And we realised very quickly that if you wanted to make a two-handed sword, we had to go through and redo every animation in the game. We hadn't built a system that was extensible because we hadn't understood it well enough at the start to realise that extensible was our goal. And that's something we're thinking a lot about in terms of kind of chasing the sequel. But anyway, here we are at the start. We've got a card game. The card game's combined with action sequences, and one of the big moments in Hand of Fate is when a card flies down on the table and your character pops out of it. And then every other card you've earned in the game, if it's a shield, the shield flies down and the shield pops onto your player's arm. If it's a sword, then so on and so forth. And that moment is there in the very first build. And it's pretty much untouched all the way to the end, because it's one of the substantial hero moments of our game. And it's one of the things we knew going in that was a linchpin. But we also were in this position where we didn't quite know, we knew the game we were making, we knew the decisions we were making day by day internally well enough to communicate to each other, to talk about what was important. What we didn't know is how to sell it to the outside world. And this is something that I think indies in general need to give some thought to. You know, what's the name of your game? How does that sell the experience? Can somebody look at a screenshot of your game and know it's your game and not anybody else's game? Can they tell from that a sort of summary of what the gameplay is going to be and how it's going to play out? Do you have like a one-line explanation of what the game is? And as you'll have noted, you know, when I started this and talked about the fact that it's kind of a dungeon crawling action RPG card game with some other stuff, a bit like FTL, and you know, there's other bits jammed onto it, and maybe it's got some of these, and it's a little bit action, and then there's cards, and we still haven't worked out how to explain Hand of Fate in a sentence. And we've been lucky, you know, now that we've reached release, that it finally got enough word of mouth and people talking about it, that's turned into people saying, well, this game, I can't really explain it. You should check it out. And that's worked in our favour, but it was still a really dumb thing to do. And we knew this like from day one when we started explaining to people what we were doing, and it took like 10 minutes, and then they had no idea what we were talking about. We knew we had like a communication problem. And I think I'm not a strong believer that your games should be driven from a marketing place first and foremost, unless you want to sell them, in which case it's worth thinking about at least, because that's what marketing is. Marketing is the selling of games. So it's really important that you give it some thought. And it's, as I say, it's a challenge that we had over the entire duration of this project. And it's something that when we appraise new projects, we're taking a lot more seriously. You know, what's the elevator pitch for this? How do you explain it? What's the hook? At its core, what does it do? And I don't think that should stop you from taking risks. I don't think that should stop you from chasing stuff that excites you. But you should always think about, how do I explain this to somebody? And when I explain it to somebody, do they get excited? You know, if you can just give them the one-liner and they get excited, then you've already fought half your battle. Particularly if you plan on doing a Kickstarter or early access or any other sort of promotion. You know, the Stranded Deep guys have said it's a survival game, you're stranded on an island. That's brilliant. Like, there's a reason they have outsold us 10 to 1, and it's because that summary people look at and they go, I want to play that game. I haven't played that game yet. I played the survival game with the zombies. I played the other survival game with the zombies. I played the survival game where it was medieval, but I haven't played the survival game where I'm stuck on an island, and I want to. And they understand it, and they can get it, and from there, the world's your oyster. So, and like I say, you don't have to make commercial work. Like, you certainly don't have to take marketing into account. You don't have to do any of this. You only have to do it if you actually want people to go out and get your game, even if it's free. You need people to be interested enough to come in the door. And new is often interesting in and of itself. So somebody recently, there was a pitch recently, which was, it's a romance simulator where you play gay orcs. That's not super commercial, but at least you know what you're getting. You know, like, that tells the story out of the gate. That's Tusk, I think, which was just recently announced. And likewise, you know, something like Gone Home has a really clear, straightforward marketing pitch. So, you know, I do urge you to learn from our mistakes and think about your marketing up front. So what we did with our early build, again, at this point in time, we thought it was about a 12-month project. By the time we were all said and done, it was a 2-year project, pretty much to the nail. But we thought it was about a 12-month project. Things like Kickstarter were starting to take off. And again, we're a responsive team. We can look at what's working for other teams and take some of that on board. So we thought, let's line up for a Kickstarter and let's start showing people. So we went to GDC and we showed kind of behind closed doors at GDC. And we had a lot of people come by and go, I have no idea what you're doing. But, you know, good luck to you, I guess. And we'd respond, so you don't, that's not an offer to publish? I gotcha. And we didn't even know if we wanted a publisher because we figured we could probably self-fund. But we wanted to get a kind of sense of who was interested. And it still wasn't clear at this point in time whether, you know, things like Ouya were a market, because they weren't. But at this point in time, the writing wasn't quite on the wall. It was just a case of, will it or won't it? Who knows? All these micro consoles, maybe they're onto something. We have a version of Ski Safari that's on GameStick because they hassled us to do that at some point. And yeah, micro consoles have never really taken off. I can say with confidence, having been on the inside. So we showed that round, and we got a sense of what people expected from the game, and we got a sense of where we needed to polish. And it was a completely faked out intro at this point in time. You know, we'd set what the cards were, what order they were in, how they were laid out on the table, how each thing flowed from the next. We had a little bit of patter so that we could explain to people as they were playing what went on, if they could be bothered sticking around for 5 minutes, which, you know, was a 50-50 at that point in time. And with all of that done, PAX Australia was coming up, and we had a booth because we'd booked a booth because it seemed like a good idea. And at that point in time, it made sense to take the game down and show it. But it was still at a really early stage. Again, it was only maybe 4 or 5 months of development at this point in time. We didn't know what platforms it was on. So even if people did play it and say, that's cool, can I buy it someday on my thing? We'd say, I don't know. I don't even know what it's coming out on. Like, and from a commercial perspective, that means, like, it's really easy to run the numbers on stuff like PAX. You know, a booth costs you a certain amount if you want to go down there. So you pay that amount, and then you say, well, how many copies would we need to sell of our game at 25 bucks to make this break even? And you end up with I don't know, if a booth costs $1,000, you end up with a lot of copies to sell. And you're like, do we even see that many people per day? Like, are we giving them something to go away with? And we've got nothing to sell yet. The game's not out yet. We don't know when it's out. But the real learning experience comes from actually watching people play your game. And there is nothing better when it comes to testing than having people play your game and completely stomp over everything that you've built and just run rampant and do everything you expected them not to. It's super humiliating and super educational. And it's often hard to get like cold beta testers into the studio. But if you go to somewhere like PAX, you will get 150 people come by every couple of hours, you know, and you'll learn a lot about your game. You know, one of the things we learned is that a lot of people would look at it and go, no, it's got writing. I don't do writing. Bye. And other people, you know, would turn up and go, oh, no, not cards. No. And others would be like, no, fighting controllers. No, don't do that. And it turns out like a lot of people, and as developers, you're probably reasonably deep in a variety of games and play a kind of broad variety of stuff, unless you play LOL, in which case, maybe not. But for the most part, like, developers play a pretty broad variety of games and know what's out there and are willing to kind of wade through some weird indie stuff where it's like, okay, this is a, you know, text-based farming and wall building simulation that is set in communist Russia. Cool, I'm down for that, I'll get in there. But you realise just how many users at the end have like really clear-cut things that they do. And this became even clearer to me when I went to Boston for PAX, and I was having breakfast with 3 other game developers, and across from us was a guy with an awesome Captain America suit and eating with a Spider-Man, and I'm like, I'm definitely in PAX town at this point in time. And the waiter said, oh, do you guys do game stuff? We said, yes. He said, I play both games, Madden and shooters. And I'm like, which shooters? He's like, the shooters. And I'm like, Call of Duty? It's like, rings a bell. I just play the shooters with my mates. I play whatever we can play together. that's either football or shooting stuff. That's my game. And we're like, cool. We don't make either of those games. He's like, that's cool. Good on you. I don't really care. And it's amazing. Like, it is really eye-opening. Even inside, you know, you've got to be pretty much a core gamer to get in the door at PAX, for that to be your weekend's entertainment. And even those people can be, a large proportion of them are really finicky. So when you do something like we did, which is blend choose your own adventures with board games, with action RPGs, you've got to understand that you're probably not building a massive tower where you're like, we have all of the board gaming fans, and on top of that, we put all of the text adventure fans, like those 9 guys, so now we've got an extra 9. And on top of that, you know, the action fans, and we have this enormous pillar of people who will love what we do. It's actually a Venn diagram where you're like, yep, it's the overlap of this, with these 9 guys, and it's quite small. But the good thing is, and this is where, you know, at the heart of kind of what I want to discuss is indie opportunities. And this is where indie opportunities come into play. You can meaningfully make a game for a small niche. And if you can make those people, like that tiny little crossover Venn diagram of people, super happy. And I think it should be like all of our mission to make somebody super happy. And often when we're building things, and I think just as makers in general, often when we're building, you say, the person I'm going to make super happy is me. Because I know what I like better than anybody else. So I'll make a game for me that I love. But what happens is you start building it, and you keep building it, and you're like, oh yeah, I know why I made this decision, I know how this works, and I've been looking at this for a year, and this is good. And somebody looks at the game and they go, I don't like it. And you go, screw you. I made it for me, not you. You can get out of here. What are you doing here? How'd you even get into my house? Fuck off. But the truth of the matter is that if you could go back in time and ask yourself before you'd started making that game, do you love it? You would probably say no, because you haven't made a game for you. You've made something that you understand so well, that you understand all the compromises, you understand all the decisions, you understand the ins and outs, and you're at peace with them all because you made all those decisions. And I'm presuming you made the best decision you possibly could along the way. So you think all of those decisions are right, and you have no ability to review your own work unless you can step back to a year earlier and say, do I like this? No, it's terrible. You know, what were they thinking? Because I don't know about you, but I find like past me is a total asshole, like who doesn't like much and is really critical. And then once I understand what's involved, I'm a lot nicer. But you've got to, if you want to meet like the past arsehole, I guarantee they're there at PAX, and they will come up with no filter and say, God, this game's terrible. I don't even know what I'm doing. What do you think? These controls are shit. Yep. You should shoot yourself. Like, this is God, and walk away. And there's kind of 2 ways you can respond to that. And if you're lucky, like me, you only like punch 1 or 2 people at PAX. And you do more listening. And you realise that you're never going to get as good a measure of kind of public interest. And that's what was great about PAX. The flip side of that, and the bit that I've talked about less, is you actually meet the people you made the game for. Like, you meet that tiny Venn diagram of people who are like, card game with a lot of reading and some board game elements and combat, I am there. Tell me about it. Can I buy the cards? I would collect decks of cards. I do collect decks of cards. I would like a deck of cards. And that's really invigorating. So we kept making that game for this tiny kind of Venn diagram crossover niche that we thought would turn into something. And along the way, we tried to meet as many kind of other people as we could to get a good sense of what was working and what was not, and the ways we could maybe broaden that out a little bit. And ultimately we have broadened it out a little bit, but not a ton. It's still a pretty niche experience. And that led to November, which is when we started really talking seriously about doing a Kickstarter. August is when we began our conversations internally about, let's get this ready for a Kickstarter, let's get our pitch together, let's work out how it's going to go. And we knew at that point in time that there were rumours that Kickstarter was coming to Australia, but we also started digging into what was involved to run up a Kickstarter on the American side or the British side. Did you need to get, and it was a huge pain in the ass, basically, it was the answer. But we thought one way or the other, we needed to be ready to go by November because the game would be done in like February, then the game was done in February, but a year later than we expected it to be done. So we got everything ready, and fortunately Kickstarter announced that they were opening the Australian site on November 12th, and that was ideal for us because it was right in the middle of where we planned. So we were there on day one on Kickstarter, ready to go with a good-looking, well-organised pitch, and because Kickstarter wanted to help support the Australians with their newly launched Australian site, they did a lot to make sure that that they publicised us. So that all worked really well. And in the end, we raised about $55,000, which was good. It wasn't the whole budget of the game by a pretty wide stretch, but it was enough for us to realise that we were on to something. It was also a little bit of a concern because it was at the low end for kind of games Kickstarters with wide reach. And again, we'd hit on this wall of how do we explain our game? You know, is it something that's instantly appealing that people say, I want that? And for most people, the answer is no. And this is where, you know, like no matter how you're going to fund your game, whether it's Kickstarter or early access or whatever part of that process you're going to go through, having a quick pitch that you can sell easily makes that much easier. That doesn't mean don't have a deep game. That means the depth of your game should be able to be quickly explained. So, but that was a really great experience, and that got us our first kind of 1,000 core players who were not my mother. Although in some cases, you know, they were direct family and people I knew and friends. And from there, we were able to start rolling builds out pretty quickly. And, you know, I think a lot of people who back a game aren't necessarily acquainted with the fact that, that games are pretty rough before they're finished. And in our case, the game was very rough before it was finished. And the first build that we shipped out was super rough. It was the first one where we felt like it actually had gameplay there and kind of mechanics, and that they interacted, and it wasn't all smoke and mirrors to make it look as good as it possibly could be. But even so, you know, we felt like it was ready for people to take a look anyway. And some people looked behind the curtains and went, cool, it's interesting, I see where it's going. Here's an extended list of bugs and issues, which was great. Some people looked at it and said, I'll come back to this later. And other people looked at it and said, whoa, this is not what I wanted at all. Could you make something totally different? And I think community management becomes a big part of any kind of game development process once you've got a community. Like once you've actually built up a few users and in any way you've got people who've bought your game or bought in with their time, you need to start working on the community management side of it. And our kind of approach to that was pretty consistent throughout, which is if anybody said, this isn't what I wanted, we would say, no problems, you can have a refund because we're not going to make something different. And that worked very well, and we've had friends who've gone through the whole early access process a lot less successfully. I think you run into some real risks as soon as you're bringing people in on your game for the promise of what it will be. You want to make sure that that promise is extraordinarily clear. Because anytime you sell somebody on the promise of what your game's going to be, and you don't deliver on that, you burn goodwill. So not only have you made somebody who wanted to love your game unhappy, but they talk about it. And other people go, oh, well, these guys are, you know, terrible. They promise the moon and deliver on nothing. So we were very, very clear from word go what we were doing. We got lots of people say, are you going to have multiplayer? And it would have been easy to answer, don't know, we'll see how it goes, and have them get on board. But the answer from us was always, no, there will be no multiplayer. But it should have multiplayer. Multiplayer makes sense. It's a card game, it should. It's not going to happen. If that's what you want, please go and buy Infinity Wars, you know, or any other multiplayer card game that exists, because that's not what we're doing. Will I be able to, you know, do co-op? No, absolutely not. Can I change the character? No, we have no character customization because, again, that whole list of animations that we did earlier that made things hard. So we were really quick to leap on, and I think it's very, very difficult to switch modes from trying to sell your game, and you always want to believe in your game and tell the world all the things that are exciting about it, to telling people no. But no, particularly no before they've bought, is actually the best thing you can possibly do. The last thing you want is anybody playing a game under false pretenses, because that just leads to bitterness, and bitterness leads to an extended Star Wars kind of quote, and it's terrible. So we did the Kickstarter, we rolled out builds on a monthly basis, and through this process we added in our dealer character, who was a fully voiced character on the other side of the table. And that's one of the things that started to finally tie everything in the game together. We had kind of narration, we had this consistency of theme and experience throughout, and that was the point, when we first started to get the voiceover in, is the point where everything started to cohere nicely. All of our systems had been delivered to the level where they blended into one another and they flowed in and out seamlessly. And the presentation was at the level now where people could start to experience the actual shipping game. And that was when we decided to go into early access. And we were in early access for about 6 months, which means that we released on early access, I guess, 6 months after our initial thought of the release date. You know, it was supposed to be a 12-month game. And we'd come to the point along the way where we'd realised that Ouya was not going to be our salvation, but that Steam looked like it was a pretty good market for us. And that's also the point at which we started trying to talk to the console platforms pretty aggressively. And we found out that both Sony and Microsoft weren't super interested in talking to us. So, and that's because they had a long line of indie developers with existing hits lined up at the gates to get their stuff on. Because they were absolutely backlogged in terms of developers, it was hard for us to get any traction on either side at that point in time. So we did what we always do when we're kind of stopped by external circumstances and moved ahead where we could move ahead. And again, I think that's really important for an indie. Big studios, big publishers, big platform holders are just the giant dinosaurs of our industry. They move slowly, they take great big steps, and occasionally they crush like entire studios underneath them. They turn around and their tail just whacks things out. Like Ouya had a lot of money behind it, and they were very much telling us that things were great and we should get on board, because that's their job. But if we'd signed an Ouya exclusive, we would have been in a really bad position. And the same thing had happened here. You know, we couldn't get much traction with the console manufacturers. If we had, we would have been happy to talk about exclusives or doing something on that side. But given that we weren't, we did the thing that we could do, which was Steam. We'd gone through the greenlight process at the same point as we'd done our Kickstarter, and I recommend that for anybody who's thinking of doing both of those things, because that way you're driving users from one to the other and it supports each other nicely. So we were greenlit, we were able to launch, and we went into early access. And at that point in time, we thought we were maybe 2 or 3 months from launch. from final shipping ready to go. You'll learn that over the whole course of this, we never got our dates even close to right. Like until it was yesterday. Once we'd launched, we could say we did launch yesterday. But if you asked us at any point to tell you accurately in the future when we would be wrong. And again, this comes down to the community management side of things. We knew we couldn't get our dates right. We knew we didn't know when the game would be done. So we never told people what the shipping date was. You know, we were very clear when we went into early access that we were heading towards ship and that we were close to the end of the process, but we didn't say, and it'll be done in 2 months, because then we would have been wrong and that would have made people sad. Or we would have tried to sign off on it in 2 months and say, well, that's the version that's done, we said we would, and that wouldn't have been good enough. So early access was great because that brought another 10,000 or so people along for the ride to play the game, to have a look, to start giving their feedback. And it's that same process that you go through at PAX, except in the case of something like Steam, you actually get a lot less opportunity to see when people just go, I don't like this at all, and go. Like if they're at your booth, you know somebody came up, tried to engage, and was lost, and you can maybe work out where you lost them. On Steam, often the person who goes doesn't tell you anything. Sometimes, if you're lucky, they give you a bad review that says, you know, this is nothing like Magic the Gathering, you're all terrible, I hate everybody. I looked up a photo of Morgan, he's an idiot with a face like a hamburger, you know. People say terrible things, like just terrible things. And, but most of the time they just go, like you just lose them. When you lose them, you don't get them back. So you only get one chance to show people. And that's why, for us, the kind of graduated process of going through Kickstarter and then from Kickstarter to early access worked really well. Because by the time we finally got through early access, at the end of kind of our 6-month run, we had a game where we knew what it was, we knew how to tell people what it was, we knew how to put together a good trailer that sold the experience. And we also knew how to make sure that the game itself explained itself and exposed itself to players quickly. So people knew what they were getting into and they could see the potential, even when they were doing the first straightforward encounter. And that's the thing that I think it's easy to miss if you talk online a lot, which I do. I try and do a lot of our community management. I post to forums. I'm active at things like this. And it's really easy to forget that even, no matter how niche your audience is, almost all of them have never heard of you. They've never read anything you've written, they've never seen anything you've done. The only thing you have to explain yourself is your game. You know, what you put in the box. Not that anything comes in a box nowadays, but you know, what you put in the box is the truth for almost everybody who plays your game. If somebody gives you any feedback, good, bad, mediocre, hamburger face, you know, that is treasure because you get so few signals back from the people who've actually played your game. And you need to take all of them as seriously as you possibly can. Analytics are good. You can get a lot back from data, but nothing reproduces having somebody there in front of you playing the game. Next on from that is somebody who's willing to write down why they liked it, why they didn't like it, why they hate it, why it didn't make sense to them, what they thought was good. Anybody who actually communicates with you has some passion about what you've done. You know, there's something that got them excited enough to hate you that much, or to say nice things, but mostly to hate you that much. And that means there's something to grab hold of. There's something that you can work with. And for us, the Hand of Fate process was really about getting as many people as possible over the course of our development to look at the game, taking what they said as seriously as we possibly could, and doing everything we could to fix it so that the next person had a new and fresh reason to hate us. Until eventually, you know, we got through all of those boundaries and some people found a reason to love it and to love what we'd done the same way we did. And kind of when it comes down to the fundamentals, I think no matter what scale you're operating at as a developer, that's the best thing you can possibly do. You know, you need to be pushing your game on everybody around you taking their feedback, looking at it, and then finding new friends and people to look at what you've done. You know, as many new, fresh sets of eyes as you can. Experts and other game developers are great, and do that wherever you can. But just the cold public that unless you're making a game for game developers, you know, like, which may be an idea. I don't know. Don't do that. Like, but there's only so many game developers. But as much as you can along the way, the goal is to harness as much feedback as you can. And in our case, that was really, at every point, we were late. We went to a Kickstarter when we'd done what we thought was a good, you know, 3/4 of the development. Turned out to be about half. But we weren't standing there right at the start selling a concept. We were much later in the Kickstarter process than most people had gone to Kickstarter. When we went to early access, we'd already been in build to our backers for 6 months. We'd knocked off all the edges we could find. It was a common comment for people in early access to say, gosh, this game isn't like a totally unfinished pile of crap like all the other early access games. We love it, which is unkind to all the other early access games. But there were certainly some bad experiences by which we looked good by contrast. When we launched having gone through as many waves of early access feedback as we could and gotten as much detailed response from people. So people went, gosh, I haven't heard of this game. And that's one of the truths of indie marketing. You know, there are 100 million people on Steam, and no matter how well you market your game as an indie, almost everybody hasn't heard of you. And you want to make your game look as appealing as possible. We did that by changing our icons over the course of the game, changing our trailers, seeing what people got responses from people, seeing which people liked, seeing what people said about the game, and turning that into the copy that we had in our promotional materials for the game. It's an ongoing process of growing your game and learning what other people love about it, and making it as easy to love as you possibly can. And in the end, I think that's kind of my biggest recommendation from a development perspective, is that you find out what people love about what you're doing and make it as easy for other people to see that as possible. Do we have time for questions? How are we looking on time? Cool. Questions? Conversation?
You mentioned that your space adventure game failed because your team as a whole didn't have a uniform idea of concept.
Yeah.
How did you solve that problem with Hand of Fate if you had a similar problem trying to explain the concept?
Because we kind of got that we liked board games, and because the reason we couldn't explain it to everybody else is because everybody else hadn't been through Hero's Call, which was our kind of action RPG Diablo style game. If you played that and we explained that we were doing that but in a non-stupid way, then it was much easier to kind of start in on Hand of Fate. So the team, we were really building on the team experience, and overall that's a quality we've tried to keep at Defiant, is that every game builds on the things we've done and adds something new. And our space adventure didn't do any of that, which is another reason it was stupid. And that was all my fault. But Hand of Fate was really a team collaboration. And it was good too, because it was sparked out of the conversations we had. We kind of have this general approach. We often talk about pitches around the office and things that we might work on. And a lot of concepts are come out with every day, but some of them stick and people are still talking about it a week later and they're going, oh, if we did that, we could do this with it as well. And some of that was what was happening with Hand of Fate's kind of origins, while the other one was crashing and burning. So.
You started off discussing not having much of a contingency plan for when the other game came on. Did you have any plans that the Kickstarter didn't actually go through? Or was that still going to actually come out?
No, we're probably still going to make the game anyway, but we would have been really, really worried that we were making a stupid game nobody wanted. And we probably shouldn't have made the game anyway if the Kickstarter didn't come off. Like, I think there's a few reasons Kickstarters can go wrong, and one is asking for way too much money, and but we'd only asked for 50k, and we came close to missing too. Like, it was hairy. We didn't do our Kickstarter as well as we should have. But I think had it failed, we really would have had to take a long, hard look at it because that would be the market saying, no, we don't want it. And we would need to make more than 50k in sales to make it worthwhile. So if we couldn't even make that, that would be a concern. But if I had my druthers, I would kickstart stuff much earlier. You know, if there was a way to set up like 5 shell companies and run a Kickstarter for each one of them, and then make the game that people actually wanted, then I'd do that. But that would be bad.
Multiple Kickstarters for a single company, right?
You can, yes, you can. The issue is that if all of them get up, like if people see that Defiant has 5 Kickstarters, they will sense, perhaps correctly, that we're not really committed to any of them. And that doesn't tend to be the best sales pitch. But Double Fine did something similar where they said, you know, we're going to do a bunch of games in the jam and we're going to let you vote on which one gets made, and people could vote, and then that got turned into a game. That turned out really badly in the end, sadly. Yeah, in the back?
Distributing for these platforms?
Steam is very, very straightforward. You basically go through the green light process. They set you up with your account there. You can then do everything required. They take 30% and ship the rest to you. So it's pretty clean. Consoles these days are still much more work, and that kind of comes down to the, you know, where's the opportunity? I think if you have enough manpower to get onto console effectively, keeping in mind that you'll need an extra person in the QA role to test your game, to make sure that it's good for console, and you probably also need an extra person on the programming side just to make sure you're compliant with all their TRCs, which are all their requirements that, for example, on the PlayStation, when I pull the controller out, it pops up the message, you have pulled the controller out correctly, and all those sorts of angles. If you've got the people on your team, it's a great opportunity at the moment to go to console, because there are a lot of game developers, and that means markets tend to flood. So it's what we generally talk about as the discovery problem. You know, how is somebody going to find your excellent game in amongst a slew of more excellent games than they could ever play with all their free time? And
You've released on Xbox One.
Yes, yeah, we have.
So what distribution method have you used for those?
So those, we're self-published on those as well, and they've opened up the doors for people to self-publish. Sorry?
Digital download only, isn't it?
Digital download only, yep. We now have a publishing agreement, now that we've come out and been a success, and I will say that all of the troubles and hardships that you go through as an indie developer are made much easier if you've had a successful title. You know, we went from publishers not wanting to meet with us to, you know, all of them saying, hey, you know, we would have loved to be involved on that. Now that it's a success, what else have you got? The self-publishing on Xbox One and PS4 worked well, and we just applied through the normal channels there and waited until our turn came up. And fortunately, we shipped our game 12 months later than we thought we would. So by the time our game was done, we were in a good position to go to those platforms. But it's a very similar process once you've been through their criteria. It just has much longer checklists and much more, you know, T's to cross and I's to dot than Steam development, for example, because you only really get one chance at releasing. It's expensive to patch on console, so you want to make sure you get it as right as possible the first time around. But yeah, we self-published. Now that we've self-published, we've got a German publisher who's offered to do boxed retail copies for both PS4 and PC, because they've seen that the overall sales numbers make that worthwhile. But it's much harder to do from the other side. We couldn't get any of those deals in place in the lead up to, which is a shame, because it would have been nice to be on shelves at the same time.
You mentioned that you aimed to raise 50k for Kickstarter, but that was only a small portion of the whole scope of the game development. Did you have to find outside investment to cover the rest of it?
We basically bet the farm on it in the end. And the farm in this case was all the revenue we'd made from other games, all the work for hire stuff we'd done. We were fortunate that we had a game that was performing pretty well in China that brought a little extra money in along the way. And at each point we went, do we have another month of cash? And it's like, we do, because it's some more's come in. Then we've got another month in the bank. But yeah, we pretty much bet the farm. You know, we'd been around for 3 years prior to that, and we took everything we'd earned to date and spent it on Hand of Fate. Which again is another reason that the Kickstarter failing would have been a sign that we were really dumb. So, Tim, you had a question?
I was just wondering how the user perception, user reactions vary between the platforms. You've got Steam, PS4, Xbox.
That's really interesting. We actually had small performance hiccups on Xbox One, which meant people were pretty responsive to the fact that, you know, that it wasn't as good a AAA experience. I think the interesting thing is that on console, everybody expected it just to be a AAA game with a AAA budget. So the response was a little less enthusiastic on that side, but it was still pretty good. We ended up about an 80 Metacritic across all platforms, 79 on PS4 and Xbox One, I think, which we were pretty happy with. The interesting thing about our game is that it kind of has elements where it looks like those sorts of games, so we tend to get judged in that case, but we get bonus points for originality. And that's the other thing, is that we started out and we weren't sure that we were making a game that was original. It was just a kind of combination of genres that made sense. But as time went on and all of those elements kind of grew together, we've received a lot of credit for the fact that the game's an original idea, or at least an original genre mash, and that's really gratifying because we had no idea. So it's kind of nice.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you guys got featured on Steam when you first released.
Yeah.
What's the process involved to get featured? Like, are you on the phone them every day, or is it just kind of pop up?
Everybody gets featured when they launch. Everybody gets 1 million clicks. Sorry, 1 million views. And then it's all algorithmically driven now. So it used to be that if you knew somebody there, they could help you to be on the front page over the course of the first week. Now what they do is that they feature you for about 1 million views, and that takes about an hour, because Steam has like an ungodly number of people using the client. And then once 1 million people have seen it, if people are clicking on it and then buying it, they keep you in the circuit, and if they're not, you just vanish. So Steam is like, that's why early access was so good for us, because we'd done a lot of user testing. We, you know, A/B tested our ads on Facebook. We'd made sure our banner was good. We'd made sure our landing page was good, and we'd honed all of that along the way. If we hadn't, I suspect we would have just dropped straight off the front page, and we did much stronger on Steam than we did on PS4 and Xbox One. Our overall sales ratio is about Xbox One and PS4 combined is about 40% of our total sales, and Steam's the other 60%. So they're kind of 20%-ish each.
So that leads to my next question. If you were to release Hand of Fate 2, would you actually go back to console again, or would you just dedicate to Steam and go all the way to mobile?
So it's worthwhile. Console was definitely worthwhile for us, and you got to keep in mind we've got a 15-person team to support, so we have bigger kind of sales figures to hit than smaller teams. If we were a smaller team, we could live quite happily just off being on PS4, or just off being on Xbox One. Either of those would be a good decision for like a 2-3 person team, and I think there's real opportunities if you've got the sort of game that connects to that sort of audience. Or Wii U for that matter. You know, Shovel Knight's done great because it's a Wii U style game, Nintendo style game on Wii. But Steam was certainly the big one for us. I think Steam is flooding a lot faster. So I think there's a concern about being able to stand out from the other titles on Steam. And Steam's also stuck, because of those algorithmic issues that I talked about, it's also stuck in a bit of a rich gets richer cycle. You know, if you're DayZ, then you've been number 1, 2 or 3 on the charts for the last year. And that means that slot's taken. So, you know, there's the next slots. And if you count out, you know, The Forest and GTA and some of the other kind of evergreen titles, you get a lot less space in those top slots than you might think. So it's a tough fight on Steam, whereas at the moment on console, each week there's a game or two launching in the downloadable space, and they get a reasonable amount of attention. So it's a real trade-off. For Hand of Fate 2, speculatively that we would make such a thing, because we haven't announced anything, but we would. We'll still try and go to everything. For the main reason being that we've already got a user base there. So hopefully we can give them more of what they liked the first time round, and it's probably worth its while there. We saw that with Ski Safari too. Ski Safari was big enough that markets that we might not have gone to normally, like the Nook, for example, were worthwhile, because even though we'd only do like 5% of our sales elsewhere, it was still worth the time in the end. And Hand of Fate's been strong enough that even though the console bit's small, it's definitely worth the time. So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing the story. And I do have a question about the feedback you guys getting from the audience.
Yeah.
If you can put the game in the market and want to play it and give a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
And people say that indie should be more open to players' feedback. But
Yep.
I see the way you handle stats my game, then I can decide what to do.
Yep.
So which way you think is the best way to go with players all the time, or just focus on developers?
So I think it's very, very important that you always listen to players' problems and largely ignore their answers, because you're the expert, you're the person making the game, you know how to solve the problem. So you need to, and mostly players will give you answers, not problems. So the example I always use is I was building a platform game in one of the companies I was working for, and there was a point in the start of the game where you only had the single jump, not the double jump, and the single jump jumped you about this high. And there was a platform up here that you needed to have the double jump for, where there was a treasure in the starting zone. And that was supposed to be the, come back here when you've got the double jump and that will be satisfying. But the truth is that if that's the normal height jump, it was only about there. This one, it still looked like you could jump it. So players would stand in front of it and jump for ages. And their feedback then would be, you need to make the jump taller. And the problem is not you need to make the jump taller. If I make the jump taller, I then break everything else in the game that's based around the jump height that we've built. The right fix is, instead of it being ambiguous and height there, it needs to be height there, so they clearly know they can't jump. And that fixes the problem. And that's the example for me of, you listen to them, you work out what their problem is, which is generally not exactly what they've told you, and you work out how to solve that problem. Or you say, no, we're not going to solve that problem, which is the other thing I did a lot of. But yeah, I think you have to consider yourself the expert on your game, but them the expert on user problems.
So mostly I think the way I can understand it is most of the time should be developer oriented.
Most of the time you should be taking the player's feedback through the developer's perspective. So your understanding of what that means for the game. And where possible, you should test that. If you can then get that player to play it again and go, has that fixed your problem? That always helps too. The other thing is, if you've got enough volume of people, a problem that 2 people point out is probably a problem. A problem that 1 person points out could be a problem that hits 1 person in 10 if you've got 10 people in your room, or it could be one that hits 1 person in 1,000, or it could be that they just really hate spiders. We had people who were like, occasionally a spider scuttles across the screen. I'm an arachnophobe, I can't play your game now. And we're like, well, suck it up. But because, how many chronic arachnophobes are there, and is this cutting down our market that much? But because Dan's nice, he put in a turn spider off option in the menu. But yeah, you've got to pick your battles on that. One more?
I'm just wondering about mobile, and we chose to, in the start, to not go for mobile, or just because it's too resource intensive?
No, we were intentionally steering away from mobile because mobile seemed to be becoming a clusterfuck. Like discoverability was really hard. And even though we'd had a successful project in mobile, we looked at free-to-play and realised we didn't know how to do free-to-play. We looked at the issue of standing out from the crowd and realised that was really hard. And we consciously wanted to hedge our bets by having something that existed in another market, which worked out for us. You know, fortunately, the Ouya took off, and you know, now we're laughing. But fortunately, we found another market before we were done. But yeah, at some point, we'll probably release it on mobile. We certainly built it. It was somewhat compromised along the way because Ouya was the first target platform. Like, it wasn't built for a console level straight out the gate. So we're looking at bringing it to Vita and then hopefully other kind of mobile platforms as well along the way. Thank you very much.